Hey everyone, we are back. Thank you so much for joining us. It's Saturday, day 4 of the She Is Me conference, and we are joined this afternoon by Meagan Cothron, and she's going to be talking about permission to reclaim your own voice.
Oh, we lost Lisa, so I'm going to pick up unless she hops back in. Welcome, everyone, and thank you to the She Is Me Global Conference for inviting me to come and share my story about how I reclaimed my voice from the throes of addiction, and wanting to share the story about how to give yourself permission to reclaim your voice. When we first enter into the world, we don't come with the language to ask questions. We simply come in and just exist and trust the environment and those that brought us into this world, and that they will shape us to become who we are destined to become. And then as we grow, curiosity begins to take hold, and we begin to become explorers of the environment around us and asking questions, which is why toddlers are most famous for the question, why? Why is this? Why is that? And as annoying as that why can be during that stage of 3 and 4, we have to have the patience to guide them with the answers that we can provide to them, because they are in that constant state of wonder, trying to make sense of everything new. And then as we get older, our questions begin to change. People start to ask us questions. What's your favorite color? What foods do you like? What foods do you dislike? And all these questions are there to help us form our own self identity. And we start to define who we are through our answers to these questions. And then somewhere along the way, we begin to lose that connection with ourselves, and the question shifts from what about me to what about them. And we start to ask the questions, what do they think of me? Do they like me? Why don't they like me? And we become so focused on belonging that we forgot to simply just be who we were always meant to be. And the journey back to ourselves begin when we start asking new questions, or asking questions that we used to ask ourselves. What do I like? What do I want? How do I want to show up in this world? And that's what About You is all about. Returning to that childlike curiosity, that raw authenticity, and remembering that you are still worth asking questions that relate to what about you. Hi, I'm Meagan Cothron, and I'm the author of What About You, co-founder of Recover Out Loud, a recovery community organization in Columbus, Indiana. And I'm an advocate and recovery leader. I'm a person of long-term recovery. 7 years. I'll be celebrating next week on the 26th. Just a little bit of my background and who I am. I'm a wife, a mom, writer, recovery advocate. I worked in the field of recovery and anti-trafficking for over a decade. Co-founder of Recover Out Loud is the first certified recovery community organization in my county that I reside in. And along the way, I used all my personal and professional experience and wrote a book, What About You, which is a memoir about healing, breaking cycles, and learning how to love myself. I always say I'm a person in long-term recovery from relational and familial trauma that was rooted and grounded from addiction and abuse. But the moment that I stopped asking, what about my dad? What about my mom? Why did my family, fall apart? Why did this happen? Why did they do this to me? Why did nothing work out? Why don't they love me? Why are they choosing other things above me? Why am I not important to them? But when I stopped focusing on them and I started asking the question, what about me, is when everything began to change. So, how did that question, what about you, become such a pivotal moment in my life? My what about me journey. It starts from growing up in survival, just learning how to cope through the life's adversity and the stressors, until I got to a moment where I could start to acknowledge those problems and start to seek those permanent solutions in my life, to where I can then start to implement these strategies that allowed me to sustain a thriving life. So let's go through my journey. I was raised by addiction and chaos. Growing up in a home, my parents were young when they first met and had me. My parents were 16 and 18. So I was raised into just young teenage parents who were still trying to figure out the world. And this, growing up in the 80s and 90s culture where alcoholism, marijuana use, the party rocker lifestyle was just a part of our upbringing. And what I once used to consider the norm, that I never even questioned of whether it was wrong or not. Followed by that addiction and chaos. You can only function in chaos for so long. And that is same is true with my family. My parents were married for 10 years. But the beginning of my life should have foreshadowed what the outcome of my family was going to be. The day of my birth, my father showed up after partying and celebrating the birth of his first child by going out and getting drunk with his friends and showing up plastered at the day of my birth. That should have been a huge red flag to my mother of what was going to happen within their marriage. Within 10 years, the addictions took over. Alcoholism set fire to abuse in our home. I remember many times being, as the eldest, I have 3 younger brothers, but as the eldest child, many times that I had to intervene between my parents to protect my mother from my father when he was in his alcoholic rage. My mother tried her best to be to not go down that road in addiction. And by the time I was 8 years old, my mother tried crack cocaine for the first time. And within 2 years, she was no longer a functioning parent. Through that, my parents ended up getting a divorce and separated. And as much as my father was to blame for allowing that into our household, not protecting my mother from the throes of addiction, I was still a daddy's girl, and I wanted to be with my father. And I chose him over my mother and didn't realize the pain that she was carrying from just trying to love my father and trying to keep our family together. I couldn't see it then as a 10-year-old girl. And as you can see in this picture, there was still so much innocence in life and happiness that was in me, even though all this chaos was surrounding me. I had so much hope that my family would be okay and that we would be together again. My mother ended up moving away. She lost herself completely in addiction. And for the next 20 years of my life, my mother would be in and out of prison, in and out of institutions, and in and out of my life. We were constantly moving. My father, even though he was more of a functioning, what they would call a functioning addict, he was constantly losing jobs to drinking while, drinking and working under the influence, DUIs, not showing up. So my whole life was just unstable. And I never had the opportunity to set firm roots into any environment that would allow me to blossom into the person that I was meant to become. So what do you do when you are stuck in survival mode and you are a 10-year-old child? You have no choice but to just adapt to the chaos. So that's what I did. I moved on with my father. My father ended up remarrying, and we blended families with my stepmother and her 2 children, which brought in a whole nother household of dysfunction and chaos, where that abuse ended up becoming more toxic for me and my brothers, and we all just kind of dispersed. I had one brother that decided to go live with grandparents. I had another brother who ended up getting in trouble and getting into juvenile detention in the criminal justice system from the age of 13. And so not only did I lose the stability of the relationship with my parents, now I'm losing that stability of the relationship that I was supposed to have with my brothers as well. And we had no choice. We couldn't stay together because we were just trying to survive on our own. So with that, I started to develop codependency and attachment. And of course, I didn't know that at the time that this was what I was developing. But by the time I was 14 years old, and again, moved to a whole new school for high school, which is another survival environment, boys became my next form of fulfilling those relationships that I had lost throughout my immediate family. At the age of 14, I fell in love for the first time and experienced my first unhealthy attachment. His name was Chad White. And with that came that bad boy, I can fix him, I can love him, savior mentality that I had already developed as a daughter to a father of addiction. And so all these skills that I was developing in my survival, I was now the perfect, I had the perfect skill set to now love this boy that was dabbling into the beginning stages of his addiction. And this was in the midst of, 2008, where the opioid epidemic was really starting to hit our communities through oxycodone and other forms of narcotics. So this was still even though addiction wasn't new to me, this was another form of addiction that I still was not mentally or emotionally prepared for. And so I just delved right in with him. I learned to put everyone else's needs above my own. Whether that was helping my father raise my 3 younger brothers, helping my boyfriend, try to be a functioning person. My friend, I just learned how to silence my own needs, not raise more chaos in the environment. So what I did was learn how to mask my own emotions, mask my own problems, because everyone else's problems around me was way bigger than mine. And I didn't want to rock the boat more than what it already was. So I learned to silence my own needs. And as I continued to go through this environment of just minimizing the pain that I was feeling, minimizing the problem of addiction that it had and the control that it had over my family, I learned how to ignore the severity of it all. And of course, at this time, addiction and recovery and support and family support systems were not as available as it is now. So what we did in previous generations was, what happens in this household stays in this household. We sweep our problems under the rug. We wake up and we just keep going with the daily grind, because we have to survive and we don't have time to stop and pause and deal with these issues that we are all affected by. So here I am in the midst of growing up to 18. I am now getting ready to graduate high school, and I'm starting to see that history is repeating itself. I've been in this relationship with my high school boyfriend for the last 3 years. His addiction was only getting worse. I was getting ready to graduate and had big plans to go off to college. And I knew that I couldn't carry his weight with me if I was going to be successful in my adult life. And so I ended that relationship. And within 3 months of us breaking up, he had died from an overdose. And I was in my first semester of college, 1 month in. And I felt that death it had taken all of my strength to keep fighting, and it won against me again. I dropped out of college, and for the next 1.5 to 2 years of my life, I didn't carry a job. I barely functioned in my life. I started taking pills as a way of coping, the heaviness of that loss and grief was just too much for an 18-year-old girl to bear on her own. And of course, I don't have the family support system to help me navigate through this loss and grief. So I did what everyone else in my family did. I turned to substance and alcohols, and I started becoming very sexually active and just attaching myself to other men to minimize that heartache that I was feeling. And at the midst of this time, my father is getting worse in his addiction as well, and we had falling out in our relationship. I was taking care of one of my brothers because my father had given up on him, and so I just felt really left alone and felt like there was no way to get out of this repetitive cycle that addiction just kept drawing me back into. And this time, I think it was coming for me and not just those around me. So as I'm going through this process, my only way of feeling like I could survive the chaos that addiction had in my life was I needed to create love in my own way. So I'm 20 years old. I am starting to pick myself up off the ground a bit. I moved into with my grandmother and started going back to college. And everything in me just craved a family. I just craved it so much that I was willing to risk myself in order to supplement the love that I had been neglected and abandoned from all these years, to find someone who could provide a family for me. And so I desperately wanted to become a mother because I felt like that was my only saving grace. So I had started dating a single father who had 3 other children. He was 10 years older than I was. And it felt like the perfect match. Here he was, a single father. Here I was, this desire to be a mother that was so strong. And I thought, this is it. This is how I can create this family and make it my own, and I don't have to be alone anymore. And so, sorry, getting a little choked up. So we did that. We decided to get married, and within a few years, we had my first daughter, and then another few years later, we had my second daughter. And I thought my life was great. I finally broke the cycle of addiction, and I now have a family, and I have all the purpose in the world, and I'm going to be the best mother that I can possibly be. And I made one vow to myself when I was 16 years old. And I made the vow that I would never become the type of mother that my mom was to me. I would become a better woman than she ever could be. And even though that vow was made out of spite and resentment as a 16-year-old girl who just missed her mother, that vow to myself also kept me from going down a deeper and darker road of addiction that I once, walked a very thin line many times. But I think that vow kept me protected. It was the one promise that I made to myself that I never broke. And so I never did walk down that road of addiction to myself, as close as I may have gotten to the line. But even though I never broke that promise to myself and getting into addiction myself, for some reason, I always accepted the behavior of those around me, that they could continue their alcoholism, they could continue their addiction, and I would still love them. And that was no different than my first husband. I ignored all the red flags of alcoholism. I ignored all the red flags of emotional and mental abuse. I ignored all the red flags that this was not the person that was going to be the supportive companion that I wanted to grow into the person I was trying to become. He was more controlling, and he was never going to allow me to do that. And after 6 years of us being together, the abuse and the alcoholism got to the point of becoming physical. And I remember sitting in my living room after another physical altercation, and I seen my 3-year-old daughter, my oldest daughter at the time, staring down below from the upstairs with fear in her eyes. And I just remember having that same fear when I used to watch my father beat my mother. And that was the second time I made a vow to myself that I would never allow a man, especially the father, put a fear in my daughter's heart that men are abusive and that women should allow that level of abuse for the sake of love. And so then I started my process of dissolving my marriage and figuring out a way to do motherhood on my own. But here we go again, another broken home. Abuse and addiction and alcoholism is now being passed on to my children. The one thing that I always try to protect them from, but because I still had unresolved trauma, I was going to pass that trauma along to my children if I didn't do something different. And I wish I could say at this moment that I completely changed and did something different, but healing doesn't happen that way. It's a little bit more messier. But I did start the process. So I ended my marriage and I decided to go back to college for the third time. And I moved from Indianapolis to Columbus, Indiana. And I left my old life behind. I left my family, my old friends behind, and I completely started a new life. Going back to college had happened a little bit before this moment. And it really took me back to finding what my meaning and my purpose and things that I was passionate about. During the time that I was leaving my husband, my father had entered into treatment for the first time at the age of 45. My mother was in recovery and was living with me. She was helping me go through my marriage and my divorce and helping me get on my feet again. So I finally had a support system on my family. I had my father in recovery. My mom was in recovery. And I had my family back. And I remember feeling so elated that here I was at the age of 25, and I've been dreaming of and praying for my family to come together since I was a 10-year-old girl, and it was finally happening. And I was walking through the recovery journey with my father. I was showing up every Sunday with him, and I was so I felt so honored to be able to be a part of that process with my dad and watching him transform and evolve, that I realized that this is it. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to help watch people grow and help them heal from the past traumas and addictions. And so I decided to go back to school to study in addiction counseling. And while I'm in school, I start my career. I started working at the rehabilitation center that my dad had just graduated from. I am, learning how to be a sufficient, self-supporting mother. And I felt like I was, progressing in a way that would lead me to the person I was always meant to become. But again, addiction had to come and blindside the hope that I was starting to develop. And if anybody has ever experienced addiction, it's conniving and it's sneaky this way. Every time you get, a few steps ahead of it, you start to gain hope. Addiction will come behind you and rip that hope away from you. And I had just started my new career, and about a month into my new job as a recovery coach, my father had just celebrated 2 years of recovery. And this typical morning was February 4th. It was one of those cold, sunny winter mornings. And I had went out to Nashville, Bloomington. I was driving through Brown County, and it was my first time driving through Brown County, and I was going to recovery coach training. And I just felt like I was so aligned with my purpose this morning. And I felt so full of gratitude. And on my way home from work that day, I was taking a different route. And it was about 4:00 in the afternoon, and I'd been in training for a whole day, and I was just ready to get home. And I was coming up to a traffic stop, and I could see ambulance ahead of me at the distance at the next light. And so I started praying for the ambulance. I could see that there was some type of accident, and I'm praying for the family, making sure everyone's safe. And I'm getting closer to the light, and I'm finally passing through the light, and I see on the left side of me, on my driver's side, I see a motorcycle laying on the ground. And that summer, my father had just purchased a Harley Davidson, a yellow Sportster, and he bought it as an 18th month celebration of his recovery. And here I see a yellow Harley Davidson on the side of the road, and the panic starts to settle in. And that whole summer, anytime I seen a motorcycle accident, I would call my father just to make sure it wasn't him, that he was safe. And so this was no different. 317-371-7653. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. No answer. Now, even though my father has struggled with addiction and instability his entire life, my entire life, one thing that is very true about my father, he always answered his phone, and he always was there for me and my brothers. I could always count on my dad to be there when I needed him the most. All right, let me call him again. 317-371-7653. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Hello, you reached Meagan Cothron. Can't get to you. Leave a voicemail and I'll call you back. At this time, the panic is now consuming my entire body, and I am turning my vehicle around so I can drive back to where the accident was, to make sure that indeed wasn't my father's motorcycle, because there's no way that can be his motorcycle. I pull up next to the motorcycle. An officer comes up to my driver's side door. He said, "Ma'am, can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I think this might be my father's motorcycle." And he reaches back into his back pocket, and he pulled my father's wallet out of his pocket. In the distance, I can see a white blanket laying on the pavement. My dad was still laying on that pavement. The accident had just happened 10 minutes prior to me driving past it. It was still very fresh. He asked me to step out of the vehicle, and I don't know if anybody has experienced these moments where time just speeds up, slows down, and pauses all at the same time. And your past, present, and future just merges into one, and time is no longer existent. This was one of those moments for me as I slowly stepped out of the vehicle, or maybe I sped out of the vehicle. I don't know what speed my body was functioning, but my mind was 10 steps ahead of my body. My mind was racing over to be next to my dad, because that was my role. I was my father's savior. I was the reason why he didn't kill himself many years ago. Me and my brothers were the reason why he kept trying and kept trying and kept trying, no matter how tired he was. He never gave up, because he always had me and my brothers to fight for. And then as I'm trying to make my way over to the white sheet that's laying on the pavement, the woman ambulance, the EMT, stopped me and said, "Honey, I can't let you see your dad like this." And so she places me in the back of the ambulance car, and I would never see my father again. 2 days prior to that moment, I called my father out for being under the influence. And this was the first time that I would learn about his relapse since he started his recovery. And I was so disappointed. I was so angry, and felt like all that hope that I had for my family to ever be sober together was just knocked the wind out of me. And I realized that was never going to happen. My dad came over, and he gave me a hug and a kiss, and he said that he's sorry and that he loved me, and he walked out of my door, and I never said I loved you back. I was angry. Little did I know that I would never be able to say those words to my dad again. But in that moment, something fueled so deep inside of me that there was no way that I was going to allow the fight that my dad had carried so long for our family, the fight that I carried so long for him, that I was going to let that just die there with him. And I made a third vow to myself that I was going to pick up that torch and I was going to break these generational cycles. I was going to walk in recovery and be a better role model and show to my family that we will not allow addiction to destroy us. And so that's what I did. And for the next decade of my life, I have dedicated my career to helping others in recovery. But it didn't stop there. I ended up getting into a relationship with someone that was addicted to heroin. Again, no matter as determined as I was to break addiction from my life, I still had this attachment to these relationships that were still riddled with addiction. And for 3 years after my father's death, I tried to be, I can fix him, I can love him, until I realized that all I was doing was destroying myself. And I was never going to save them. I was never going to fix them. And the only thing I could really ever do was fix and heal myself. And so I finally broke that relationship. And that is when I found that I came to my real emotional rock bottom. And that was when my real life in recovery started to take place. So the stages of recovery has to look at healing the root and digging down into where is the pain actually coming from. And that can take a process of time, because oftentimes when we are addressing pain, we often address on the surface, on a symptom level. And I always say this 3-year relationship to someone who struggled with heroin addiction was just my Band-Aid that I used to cover up the wound that my father left me. I couldn't save my father from addiction, so now I'm going to save him. And it allowed me to repurpose that pain that I felt from the loss of my father and gear it towards someone else who had a pain similar to my father's, and see if I can restore and recycle that pain through my love for that person. But then once I ripped off that Band-Aid and I started to dig deep into the grief of my father, and I started to dig deeper into the abandonment and neglect of my mother, and I started to see how these patterns from the loss of my family from the time I was 10 years old led into the loss of my boyfriend in high school from an overdose that led to a divorce of abusive alcoholic husband that led to leaving my husband for someone with a deeper addiction to heroin. All these things were just an attempt to cover the symptoms and manage the symptoms, and not actually go into the root and repair it and restore it. And that's what I had to do. And it was not easy, and it was messy, and it came with many challenges, and it definitely wasn't this linear process. For 6 months, I went from feeling like I had just hit the rock bottom of an emotional heartbreak. This is the part where I say that I went through an open heart surgery, because my heart needed to be completely restored and renewed, and that I just needed to start afresh with my heart, because my old previous heart had been so battered and bruised and broken from every relationship from the time I was born until I was 28 years old. I just needed a new heart surgery, a replacement, and have an open heart surgery. But what happens when you have an open heart surgery? One of the things that the doctors will tell you is that you got to change your lifestyle. It doesn't do you any good to get a new heart and go right back to the same habits that's going to stress your heart out again and batter and bruise it all over, to where you are going to have to go through the same process of emotional healing. So if I was going to do this time of open heart surgery and getting a new heart, I was going to have to look at the lifestyle and the habits and the relationships and do everything I can to protect this new heart, because I didn't deserve to put my heart and the love that I had, still had hope for, and put it through that all over again. And I don't think I could survive it a second time around. So I had to be very intentional about the care of myself during the 6-month process. Went from journaling, spending time with myself in the morning, starting to get into exercise and surrounding myself around other positive women who were fighting different battles. I remember I was in a group class that was a Pound Fitness class, and I was still going through the depths of my heartbreak, where I couldn't even get through a workout without crying. I was in tears most of the day at this point. I felt very weak, emotionally, physically, spiritually, all the things. And I remember this older woman being in that class, and she was fighting through cancer. And she just had this upbeat, positive energy. And she was just so full of gratitude for life. And she was just crushing these exercises. And she was probably about 30, 40 years older than me. And I just remember looking at her like, wow, if she can be that strong and that upbeat and that much energy and get through a work routine without falling apart, and she's fighting cancer, then surely I can get through this heartbreak and get through this 45-minute routine without falling apart. And I just remember something came over me that day, because I was starting to draw strength of the other women. And no matter what we were fighting, we all are fighting something. And when you can draw that energy and surround yourself by other women or other people who have that strength and that power that you are trying to look for, that confidence, it's contagious. And before you know it, you are starting to operate in that same strength and confidence. And the next thing you know, I am blasting through a 45-minute routine. And I remember the first time I didn't cry. And I remember, wow, this is my strength coming back. And this is when I knew that I was on my way to this long-term healing and recovery, and I was never going to go back to the things that once hurt me. But in order for me to do that, I had to continue to work down this process and continue to find people that was going to support me and hold me accountable to my long-term road of recovery. So these lifestyle changes were setting healthy boundaries with my family relationships. This was cutting my mother out and setting that boundary that if you don't get help, because my mom was back and forth in her recovery and she kept relapsing, same with my brothers. I started to cut out the relationships that were no longer healthy to me and supportive of my recovery. I became very firm in my ability to say no without shame and guilt, or like I'm letting people down. I was no longer a people pleaser. I had a supportive community that I ended up coming into called Recover Out Loud, which is me and my husband's nonprofit. But at the time, it was just a group of people that came together to talk about what we wanted out of life. Journaling has always been a daily practice for me. As young as 15 years old, I started journaling, and I have 20 years of journals that I've collected and gathered. And I really do believe that journaling was the reason why I was able to get through the chaos that I grew up in around addiction and the loss of my family and the loss of my father and the loss of my high school boyfriend and all these hardships that I had went through. I was able to find my voice on those pages when I felt like no one was listening to me or even cared to hear what I had to say. I went from shifting from that survival mode to intentional living. Every decision I made from this moment had an intention to it. Was this going to be supportive of the new life that I wanted? Was this healthy for me and my daughters? Was this something that I wanted for the long term? And if it wasn't, then I would say no. I started to prioritize health and movement and self-care and really driving a full lifestyle around my recovery. And I became so protective over my newfound recovery that anything that's touched my life, every area has been recovery rooted. My family life is rooted in honesty and connection. I have 2 daughters now they're now 13 and 10, and they know all about trauma and addiction, and they're still facing this same trauma with their father, who is still facing alcoholism. But they now have my husband, who is just as honest with them, and we have this great connection of just trust that we are always going to be here for each other. My goal was to make sure that my kids never have to heal from childhood trauma, and that's something that I will never turn my back on. I have learned to turn my pain into purpose through advocacy and service. The last decade of my life, I have done work in the anti-trafficking movement, working with survivors of trafficking. And a lot of those survivors came from that same chaos that I grew up in. They have struggled with alcoholism and addiction and relational trauma. I have worked in the field of recovery and treatment. I am now a business development and community relations for a local treatment center here in Indiana, and I still run my nonprofit. My voice has been used on so many different platforms because I refuse to allow my pain to be worthless, because what I went through was worth it if it helps supports those who are going through something similar. And again, back to my vow that I would never allow my dad's life to be wasted, and I would use my voice to say the things that he was unable to say. I learned to create space in my life for joy, for rest, and always looking for new possibilities to experience life in its full capacity. And turning my story into purpose. In this picture, I wanted to end it here, because all about reclaiming your voice is really about giving space to that inner child, that version of you at whatever age it was that got left behind, that got silenced through the pain. If you're anything like me, I felt like their pain was always bigger than mine. Their problems was always more of a higher priority than mine. And I always said, I can handle it. I can handle it. I'm strong. And all those things is true. But at what point did I have to sacrifice myself just because I can handle it, just because I knew I would be fine? And so this journey of what about you started the moment that I first entered my first recovery meeting, the first day that I met my now husband. And I was talking to his best friend, telling my life story, and it was the same old dance. My dad did this, my mother did this, I grew up like this, it's my childhood upbringing, blah, blah, blah. And I was telling him, the same story that I always tell people, the same story I told myself for years. If my family had been better, if my dad had just stayed sober, I would be fine. And I remember his friend, who his name's Jason, he looked at me and said, but what about you? And those 3 words did something inside me, and it startled my thinking process, because I didn't have an answer. All my answers had been geared towards them. What about them? That's what my brain was wired to think about. And so in that moment of my first day of my recovery, almost 7 years ago now, on October 22nd, 2018, was the first time someone had given me permission to think about me. And how was I the problem? What was the solutions that I was blocking myself from finding, because I wasn't giving me the space to even think about what I really wanted out of life, how I wanted to show up in life. How did I want to use my story for a purpose? And what did I want to do with the rest of my story? And so I want to leave it here is I want this moment to be the moment that I do for you that Jason did for me 7 years ago. What about you? What do you want from your life? And what do you need to do from today moving forward to show up in a way that this world may not have given you permission to show up before? Claim your space. Take your voice back and use it for the better purpose, and share it with those who may struggle in the way that you once struggled. Your story matters and it has a purpose behind it. And this is why I learned to turn my story into my purpose of helping women and other people who, like me, felt silenced, unheard, and possibly forgotten. And that's why I'm asking you, what about you? And this is all about me. And this is how I came to heal that inner child in me and become the full woman that I am today. Thank you.
Hi, Meagan.
Hi.
Hi, I'm back. We have a little bit of a lag, but I did want to thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story, your experience, your strength, and your hope. We
Thank
appreciate
you so
you.
much. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will be back in just a few minutes. We're going to be back with Jade Lore. So stay tuned.